My fiancé didn't know I spoke fluent German. When I heard what he said to his investor about stealing my inheritance, I took off my engagement ring right there at the restaurant table. I'm 63 now, and people always ask me how I learned to spot red flags in relationships. I tell them it wasn't wisdom that taught me. It was one dinner that changed everything. This happened when I was 28. I was working as an assistant teacher at a bilingual elementary school in San Francisco, making $32,000 a year. Not much, but I loved it. I loved seeing children's faces light up when they finally understood a new concept. I loved the smell of crayons and construction paper. I loved going home tired but fulfilled. Marcus didn't see it that way. Marcus was my fiancé of 4 years. He was 35, worked in commercial real estate development, and made 6 figures. He wore expensive suits, drove a BMW, and had opinions about wine that I never quite understood. When we first met at a mutual friend's barbecue, I was charmed by his confidence. He seemed so sure of himself, so certain about where he was going in life. At 24, fresh out of college and unsure of everything, I found that attractive. But confidence, I learned, can curdle into arrogance so gradually you don't notice until you're choking on it. It started small. He'd make little comments about my job. "Still wiping noses?" he'd say with a laugh when I came home. Or, "When are you going to get a real career?" He said it like he was joking, but there was always an edge underneath. When I talked about my students, he'd change the subject. When I mentioned a professional development workshop I wanted to attend, he'd say, "Why bother? You're not going to be teaching forever anyway." I asked him once what he meant by that. He kissed my forehead and said, "When we're married, you won't need to work so hard. You could do something part-time, or volunteer, or just focus on the house." I should have paid attention to how that made me feel. Like I was shrinking, like my dreams fit in a smaller and smaller box each time he spoke. But I didn't. I told myself he was just being practical. He wanted to provide for me. He wanted me to be happy. These are the lies we tell ourselves when we're afraid to be alone. 2 months before the dinner that changed everything, Marcus proposed. We were at an expensive restaurant in Nob Hill, the kind with cloth napkins and waiters who explain each dish like it's a museum piece. He got down on one knee right there in front of everyone, pulled out a ring that probably cost more than I made in 6 months, and said, "Make me the happiest man alive." Everyone clapped. The couple at the next table sent over champagne. I said yes because saying no in front of 50 strangers felt impossible. I said yes because 4 years is a long time to invest in someone. I said yes because I thought maybe marriage would fix the distance I felt growing between us. It wouldn't have, but I didn't know that yet. The ring felt heavy on my finger from day one. Now, here's the part Marcus never knew about me. And it's important. My grandparents on my mother's side were German immigrants. Opa Wilhelm and Oma Greta came to America in 1952, carrying 2 suitcases and dreams of a better life. They settled in a German community in Milwaukee, where they ran a small bakery. Every summer from age 5 until I was 15, I spent 2 months with them. Opa refused to speak English at home. "You're half German," he'd say in German, his thick eyebrows knitting together seriously. "You should know your heritage." So Oma taught me while we rolled out strudel dough, thin as paper. Opa taught me while we walked to the bakery at 4 in the morning, the street still dark and quiet. By the time I was 12, I was fluent. By 15, I could discuss philosophy and literature in German. When Opa died my junior year of high school, I inherited his entire collection of German books. When Oma died 2 years later, I inherited something else, $75,000, their life savings, money from the bakery, carefully saved, carefully invested. "For your future," Oma's will said. "For your dreams." I put it in a savings account and didn't touch it. That money was sacred. It smelled like flour and cinnamon, like early mornings and unconditional love. I was saving it for something important. Maybe a down payment on a house someday. Maybe starting my own tutoring center. I wasn't sure yet, but I knew it mattered. Marcus knew I had inheritance money. I told him early in our relationship, wanting to be honest about finances. What I never told him was how much. What I never told him was that I spoke German. It simply never came up. He never asked about my grandparents, not really. When I mentioned them, he'd nod absently and change the subject to something about his family, his job, his plans. He never asked what language they spoke, what country they were from, what traditions I might have learned. In 4 years, he never once asked to see photos of them or hear stories about my childhood summers in Milwaukee. That should have told me everything I needed to know. 3 weeks after the engagement, Marcus started talking about a big deal he was working on. A German investment group was looking to fund commercial properties in the Bay Area, and Marcus's firm had put him in charge of the pitch. "This could make my career," he kept saying. "If I land this, I'll make partner by next year." He spent weeks preparing. Spreadsheets covered our dining room table. He practiced his presentation on me so many times I had it memorized. He hired a consultant to teach him basic German business phrases, which he pronounced so badly I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. "Guten Tag," he'd say, but it came out like Guten Tag. He was very proud of himself. 2 weeks before the meeting, he told me the German CEO wanted to meet over dinner instead of in a conference room. "Herr Klaus Müller," Marcus said reverently. He's old school, 60-something, very traditional. He likes to get to know business partners personally before committing money. Marcus looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. He specifically asked if I was married. I told him, engaged. He wants to meet you. My stomach tightened. "Why?" "Germans are big on family," Marcus said, waving his hand dismissively. "It's a culture thing. They want to know their business partners are stable, reliable. Family men." He said family men like it was a credential, like a degree from Harvard. "So I'm a prop," I said quietly. "Don't be dramatic." He kissed my cheek. "You're my beautiful fiancé. Just wear something nice. Smile, and let me handle the business talk. It'll be over before you know it." The dinner was scheduled for a Saturday evening at Schroeder's, an old German restaurant in the financial district. Marcus spent an hour getting ready, trying on 3 different suits before settling on the navy one. He gelled his hair back and put on cufflinks that had belonged to his grandfather. "Remember," he said as we drove there, "just be pleasant. Don't bring up your teaching job too much. It's not exactly impressive to someone like Herr Müller." I looked out the window and didn't answer. Schroeder's was exactly what you'd expect. Dark wood paneling, murals of alpine villages, waiters in traditional vests. It smelled like beer and sausages and sauerkraut. As soon as we walked in, I felt something shift in my chest. It smelled like Opa's bakery, like early mornings and flour-dusted aprons, like home. Herr Klaus Müller was already seated at a corner table when we arrived. He stood immediately, all 6 feet of him, his silver hair perfectly combed, his suit impeccably tailored. He had the kind of face that had seen a lot of life and found most of it amusing. "Herr Chandler," he said, shaking Marcus's hand firmly. "Good to finally meet in person." Then he turned to me, and something in his expression softened. "And you must be the fiancé. Sophia, yes?" "Yes," I said, shaking his hand. His grip was warm, solid. "It's nice to meet you, Herr Müller. Please, sit." He gestured to the chairs. A waiter immediately appeared to take drink orders. Marcus ordered a beer he couldn't pronounce correctly. I ordered a Riesling. The conversation started pleasantly enough. Herr Müller asked about the wedding plans, and I answered while Marcus watched me like a hawk, ready to jump in if I said something wrong. When Herr Müller asked what I did for work, I felt Marcus tense beside me. "I'm a teacher," I said. "Assistant teacher, actually. At a bilingual elementary school." "Ah." Herr Müller's face lit up. "Education. Very important." "What languages?" "English and Spanish, mostly. I help kids who are learning English as a second language transition into—" "That's fascinating," Marcus cut in smoothly. "But Sophia's being modest. She's thinking of doing something different after we're married. Something with more flexibility." Herr Müller's eyes flicked to Marcus, then back to me. Something passed across his face, too quick to read. "I see." The waiter came to take our orders. I ordered schnitzel. Marcus ordered sauerbraten, mispronouncing it badly. Herr Müller ordered in rapid German, which made the waiter's face brighten with recognition and pleasure. After the waiter left, Marcus laughed nervously. "I'm afraid my German is terrible. I've been trying to learn some business phrases, but no matter," Herr Müller said kindly. "Your proposal was in English. Very well done, by the way." "Quite thorough," Marcus beamed. They started talking about the investment opportunity. I listened politely, sipping my wine, watching the other diners. A family with 3 children sat nearby, the parents speaking German to each other. The youngest, maybe 6 years old, was having trouble cutting his meat. His mother reached over to help, murmuring soft encouragement in German. I felt a sudden, sharp ache for Oma. Marcus was deep into his pitch now, talking about projected returns and market analysis. Herr Müller listened carefully, nodding occasionally, asking smart questions. He was clearly brilliant and careful with his money. I could see why Marcus was nervous. Then Herr Müller held up a hand. "Forgive me," he said. "This is excellent information, but I wonder if we might take a short break from business. I like to know the people I work with, not just their numbers." He smiled at me. "Sophia, tell me about your family. Where are you from originally?" "I was born in California," I said, "but my grandparents on my mother's side came from Germany. Bavaria, actually. They ran a bakery in Milwaukee." Something shifted in Herr Müller's expression. Interest, recognition maybe. "Bayern," he said softly. "Beautiful country. Did you know them well?" "Very well." I felt my throat tighten. I spent every summer with them until I was 15. They practically raised me. And they spoke German at home, I imagine? This was it. The moment where I could have said yes. I speak German fluently. I understand every word you've said tonight. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the way Marcus's hand had tightened on his fork. Maybe it was the warning look in his eyes. "They did," I said carefully, not lying but not volunteering more. Herr Müller held my gaze for a long moment, and I had the strangest feeling he was seeing right through me. Then he nodded and turned back to Marcus. "Well then, shall we discuss the specifics of the investment?" Marcus practically sagged with relief. "Absolutely. So, as I was saying, the properties we've identified have an average—" "Actually," Herr Müller interrupted gently, "if you don't mind, I'd prefer to discuss some of these details in German. I think better in my native language for complex financial matters. You understand?" Marcus's face fell slightly. "Oh, yes, of course. I can try to follow, but—" "No need to worry," Herr Müller said smoothly. "I'll translate the important parts. This is just for my own comfort." He glanced at me with an apologetic smile. "I hope you don't mind, Sophia. Business talk can be quite boring." "I don't mind at all," I said, and meant it. What happened next, I will remember for the rest of my life. Herr Müller switched to German, and Marcus nodded along like he understood, which he clearly didn't. They were speaking rapidly, casually, about the investment proposal. Herr Müller asked questions in German. Marcus smiled and said things like, "Yes, exactly, and I'm glad you see it that way," responding to tone rather than content. I picked at my schnitzel and pretended not to understand. Then Herr Müller said something in German that made my fork freeze halfway to my mouth. "Tell me, Herr Chandler," he said in German, his tone still pleasant and businesslike, "what does your fiancé think about this investment?" Marcus laughed and responded in English, "Sophia? She doesn't really understand business. She's a teacher." Herr Müller continued in German, "But surely for such a large investment, you've discussed it with her." "Not really," Marcus said in English, clearly not understanding the question but responding to what he thought was being asked. "She trusts me to handle the financial stuff." "I see," Herr Müller said in German. Then, switching tones slightly, he said, "And your finances are separate currently?" "Yes, until the wedding," Marcus said, still in English. He laughed. "But I'm working on that." I felt something cold slide down my spine. Herr Müller leaned back, switching fully to German now, his voice casual like he was discussing the weather. "And tell me, how do you plan to handle your finances after marriage?" Marcus, completely oblivious, responded in English. "Well, we'll combine everything, of course. Joint accounts. Makes things simpler." "And your fiancée has her own savings, yes?" Herr Müller asked in German. "Oh, yes," Marcus said, actually laughing now. "She inherited money from her grandparents, about 75,000. She's just been sitting on it in some savings account, not even making decent interest. It drives me crazy." My breath stopped. Herr Müller's face remained perfectly neutral. "And you have plans for this money?" he asked in German, his tone merely curious. This was when Marcus made his mistake. Maybe he thought he was bonding with Herr Müller. Maybe he thought this was what businessmen did, shared strategies, showed how clever they were. Maybe he was just so used to dismissing me that he forgot I was sitting right there. Actually, Marcus said, leaning forward conspiratorially, still speaking in English while Herr Müller spoke German, that's part of my strategy here. Once we're married, I'll have access to that money through the joint account. She won't even notice if I move it gradually. I can use it as additional capital for investments like yours. Teachers don't really pay attention to money matters. She just wants enough to buy groceries and craft supplies for her classroom. He laughed. Actually laughed. The German waiter refilling my water glass stumbled slightly. He'd understood. He met my eyes for just a second, and I saw pity there. Herr Müller's expression didn't change, but something cold entered his eyes. He continued in German, his voice still pleasant. So you would take your wife's inheritance without her knowledge to fund business investments? Exactly, Marcus said in English, completely missing the change in tone. And the best part is, if the investments pay off, which this one definitely will, I'll have turned her $75,000 into maybe $200,000 in a few years. She'll never know the risk I took, but we'll all benefit. It's smart capital management. And if the investment fails? Herr Müller asked in German, his voice now like ice underneath silk. Won't happen with a conservative property investment like this, Marcus said confidently. But even if it did, it's not like teachers need expensive things. We'd tighten our belts for a while. She'd never know the difference. The air felt thick. My hands were shaking. I set down my fork carefully because I was afraid I might throw it. Herr Müller looked at me then. Really looked at me. And in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that he knew I'd understood every single word. He spoke to me directly for the first time in German, his voice gentle. Fräulein, this must be difficult to hear. Marcus continued nodding and smiling, thinking Herr Müller was making some generic comment to include me in the conversation. I could have stayed silent. I could have pretended I didn't understand, finished dinner, gone home, and quietly broken off the engagement later. That would have been the safe choice, the non-confrontational choice. But I thought about Oma, carefully saving every dollar from the bakery. I thought about Opa, pressing German vocabulary books into my hands. I thought about every time Marcus had dismissed my job, my passions, my opinions. I thought about the life I would have had with him, slowly disappearing into the background of his ambitions, my inheritance funding his dreams while mine dried up like flowers in a forgotten vase. I looked at Herr Müller and responded in perfect German, my accent the same as my grandparents', each word clear and deliberate. It is difficult, Herr Müller, but it's better to know the truth now than to discover it after signing a marriage license. The effect was instantaneous. Marcus's face went sheet white, his mouth fell open. The wine glass in his hand tilted, spilling red wine across the white tablecloth. He didn't even notice. You speak German? He stammered. Fluently, I said, still in German, looking at Herr Müller instead of Marcus. My grandparents made sure of it. They said knowing your heritage was important. They also taught me that family money should be treated with respect, not stolen for business ventures. Herr Müller's expression didn't change, but I saw something that might have been approval in his eyes. Marcus found his voice. How long have you... Since I was 5 years old, I said, switching to English now so there would be no misunderstanding. I've understood every word tonight, every plan you have to steal my inheritance, every dismissive comment about my intelligence. Every assumption that I'm too stupid to notice my own money being moved. Steal is a strong word, Marcus said weakly. It would have been our money. No, I said flatly. You said I wouldn't notice. You said you'd move it gradually. You said teachers don't pay attention to money matters. That's theft, Marcus. That's financial abuse. Call it what it is. People at nearby tables were starting to stare. Marcus's face was red now, a vein throbbing in his forehead. Can we discuss this at home? He hissed. I reached up and slowly pulled off the engagement ring. It came off easily, like it had never really belonged there. I placed it on the table next to his wine glass. In the spreading puddle of Cabernet, we have nothing to discuss, I said. We're done. I stood up. My legs felt shaky, but I kept my chin up. Herr Müller stood as well, the old-fashioned gentleman. He spoke to me in German. Fräulein, I wonder if you might have a moment to speak before you leave. Marcus tried to stand, tried to say something, but Herr Müller held up one hand and spoke to him in English for the first time since switching to German. Sit down, Herr Chandler. You and I are finished. I do not do business with men who steal from their families. I wasn't going to. You were, Herr Müller said, his voice cutting through Marcus's protests like a knife. And if you'd steal from your own wife, you'd certainly steal from me. Our meeting is over. He gestured for me to follow him, and I did, walking past Marcus's stunned face without a backward glance. We stopped near the entrance, away from the tables. The host was pretending not to stare. I apologize for putting you through that, Herr Müller said quietly in German, but I needed to be certain of his character. You knew I spoke German, I said. It wasn't a question. I suspected from the moment you mentioned your grandparents from Bavaria, the way you said it, with perfect pitch on the word Bayern, and your eyes. He smiled slightly. You were following our conversation too carefully for someone who supposedly didn't understand. And you tested him anyway. I test everyone, Herr Müller said simply. Character reveals itself in how we treat those we think cannot hear us, cannot understand us, cannot fight back. Your fiancé failed spectacularly. I felt tears threatening and blinked them back. Thank you for making me see. You already saw, he said gently. You just needed to hear it said out loud. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. My company is opening an education technology division here in the United States. We develop language learning programs for schools. We need someone who understands both education and German culture. Someone who knows what it means to truly learn a language, not just memorize business phrases. I took the card. My hands were still shaking. If you're interested, he continued, call me Monday. The position would be education director for the U.S. division. It pays considerably more than assistant teaching, and the work would be meaningful. We could use someone with your passion. You're offering me a job? I said stupidly. You don't even know my qualifications. I know you're fluent in at least 3 languages. I know you care deeply about education. I know you have integrity and courage, both of which you displayed tonight. And I know my instincts about people. He smiled. What I saw in you tonight is worth more than any resume. I looked down at the card. Klaus Müller, CEO, Müller Education Technologies, a Munich address and a San Francisco office. My voice cracked. I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it, he said kindly. Take time. Process what happened tonight. Call me when you're ready. Behind us, I heard Marcus call my name. I didn't turn around. I should go, I said. Herr Müller nodded. Go home. Have a good cry. Eat ice cream. Call a friend. Do whatever helps. But remember this, you just saved yourself from a terrible mistake, and you did it with dignity and grace. Your grandparents would be very proud. That's when the tears came. I thanked him and walked out into the San Francisco evening, where the fog was rolling in and the streetlights were coming on, and somewhere in the distance a cable car bell was ringing. I took the bus home because Marcus had driven us there. I sat in the back and cried quietly while the city passed by outside the window. An elderly woman sitting across from me offered me a tissue without asking questions. That's San Francisco for you. Everyone's been there. By the time I got back to my apartment, the one I'd kept even after Marcus suggested I move in with him, thank God I was exhausted. I called my best friend Rachel, told her everything, and she came over with ice cream and wine in righteous fury. I never liked him, she said, which was a lie. She thought he was charming at first, like everyone did. I should have seen it, I said. He was careful, Rachel said firmly. That's what manipulators do. They're careful. I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about everything Marcus had said, everything he'd planned. How long had he been planning it? Had he proposed because he loved me or because he wanted access to my money? How many other things had he lied about? But I also thought about Herr Müller's business card, sitting on my nightstand. Education director, meaningful work, a fresh start. Monday morning, I called in sick to the school. I wasn't ready to face anyone yet, but I did pick up the phone and call the number on Herr Müller's card. His secretary put me through immediately. Ah, Fräulein Sophia, he said warmly. I hoped you would call. I'd like to discuss the position, I said. If the offer is still open. It is. Can you come to my office this afternoon? The interview lasted 2 hours. We spoke entirely in German. He asked about my teaching philosophy, my views on language acquisition, my experience with curriculum development. I was honest about my limitations. I had no business experience, no management background. "You can learn business," he said. "I cannot teach someone to care about education the way you do. I cannot teach integrity. These things are either in your character or they are not." He offered me the job that afternoon. $65,000 a year to start, with performance bonuses. It was more than double my teaching salary. I accepted. The next 6 months were chaos. I had to learn business basics, German corporate culture, education, technology systems. I worked 12-hour days and came home with my brain so full I could barely speak. But I loved it. I loved building something new, loved being treated like my opinions mattered, loved using my skills in ways I'd never imagined. Marcus tried calling for 3 weeks straight. I blocked his number. He sent emails. I deleted them. He showed up at my apartment once, and I called the police. Eventually, he gave up. I heard through mutual friends that his deal with Herr Mueller fell through, obviously. His firm was disappointed. He was put on probation. 6 months later, he left the company. Last I heard, he was selling residential real estate in Sacramento and engaged to someone else. I hope she speaks a language he doesn't. As for me, I stayed with Mueller Education Technologies for 7 years. I built the U.S. division from the ground up, hired 20 people, developed programs that helped over 100 schools. When Herr Mueller retired, he recommended me to the board as the new CEO of the U.S. operations. I met my husband, David, at a conference in Portland 4 years after that dinner. He's a high school German teacher who volunteers with refugee resettlement programs. On our third date, I told him about my grandparents, about Opa's bakery and Oma's strudel. He asked to see pictures. He actually cared. We've been married 17 years now. I still have Oma's $75,000, by the way. Well, technically it's worth considerably more now, invested properly and grown over time. I never needed it for emergencies. I never had to use it as a safety net. A few years ago, David and I used part of it to start a scholarship fund for children of immigrants who want to study education. We call it the Greta and Wilhelm Scholarship. I think about that dinner sometimes, about how my whole life changed in the span of one conversation I wasn't supposed to understand. I think about how close I came to marrying Marcus, to waking up one day and finding my inheritance gone, my dreams siphoned off to fund someone else's ambitions. But mostly I think about Herr Mueller and what he taught me that night. Character reveals itself in how we treat those we think cannot hear us. The way Marcus spoke about me when he thought I couldn't understand told me everything I needed to know. The way Herr Mueller tested him, protected me, and offered me a way forward showed me what integrity really looks like. I'm 63 now. I still work in education, though I stepped down from the CEO position 2 years ago. I consult, I mentor, I teach. David and I travel to Germany every year to visit Opa and Oma's graves in Munich, where they're buried side by side. And sometimes, when I'm speaking to groups of young teachers or women starting their careers, I tell them this story. I tell them to pay attention to how the people who love them talk about their dreams. I tell them to notice who asks questions about their lives and who changes the subject. I tell them that silence isn't always politeness, and sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is reveal that you've been listening all along. Your grandmother was right, you know. Know your heritage. Learn the language. Understand where you come from, because you never know when that knowledge will save your life. Or at least save you from a terrible mistake at a German restaurant on a foggy Saturday night in San Francisco,